Welcome back to The Real News for part two of our conversation with Janet Redman from Oil Change USA. We're talking about the two big actions planned consecutive Saturdays in Washington, D.C. and cities across the globe. This Saturday is the March for Science. Next Saturday is the People's Climate March. And Janet, I wanted to ask, because Donald Trump says that he also wants to end spending on building climate resilience communities. So what could the fallout be from this?
I mean, it's huge. I grew up on the East Coast. I'm from New Jersey. So I think of Hurricane Sandy and the number of families who were left in deplorable conditions, who were digging out of rotten, moldy basements months after Hurricane Sandy. What that means is people will be less prepared for disasters that we know are coming as the atmosphere gets warmer. He's talking about cutting money to prepare emergency responders to deal with these kinds of impacts. I mean, that to me seems very cynical to leave communities high and dry. It also means how do communities rebound from these kinds of impacts and not just get back to where they were before an extreme weather disaster, for example, but how do they really pitch forward and rebuild in a way that makes them more resilient, whether that means having better decentralized energy systems, having better transportation systems. If that money is stripped, that's going to impact families at the very local level, at the household level. So to me, that's a real ideological pitch that says, you know, it's more than climate denial. It's more than looking at the interests of the fossil fuel industry. It's actually saying, I'm going to leave a bunch of communities behind, and I don't really care. I think that's incredibly harmful and very cynical.
Congressman Lamar, who we saw earlier in the clip, had his honest and open new EPA Science Treatment Act to restrict the use of research in EPA regulatory processes. It passed a House vote 228 to 194 on the same day. So what does it mean to, quote, restrict the use of research in EPA regulatory processes?
This is, I think, we're seeing a really concerning shift in the way politicians talk about science. This is an incredibly explicit example of politics mucking in a place where politics doesn't belong. We should have the data about what's happening, in the world around us. What we do with that data is obviously part of our politics. How we use that data to pass policy is obviously part of our legislative cycle, part of what the administration does through regulation. But the idea of saying we're not going to even let certain science come to light because we don't like the implications of that based on our ideologies, that's really putting us at a disadvantage, both economically, but really in thinking about how we plan for the future and for the impacts that we know are coming. There's little disagreement at this point that with a warming world, we are going to see increasing extreme weather events. We're going to see impacts on food prices, on energy prices. We need to at least have the data so we can make smart decisions. We may disagree about what we should do with that data. We should at least be able to see the data.
So talk a bit about the March for Science event happening this Saturday. Why has your organization, The Price of Oil, supported this event?
So the March for Science, I think, is an important next step almost from the Women's March. It's basically a community of folks who have not necessarily seen themselves as activists. I think, as someone who was trained in science, we think of ourselves as objective, logical, looking at clear data, exploring important questions and coming up with answers, but continue to ask questions. Again, not usually activists, self-identified as activists, but I think what's important about this is there are people around the country who are marching, as you said, in 500 different locations around the country saying, science matters. We need to listen to science. We need to listen to scientists. And it's time for people who practice science to come forward and make their voices heard. I think it's an incredibly interesting and important moment that this community is coming together with the climate community. And we actually have this incredible week of bookends of the Science March and the People's Climate March. And in the middle, hundreds of events happening around the country around teach-ins, around candidate trainings, around youth events, around Indigenous people speaking out about the impacts of climate change. So I think this kickoff event of a week of really interesting conversation and debate and action is an important manifestation of a new group of people saying we need to really make our voices heard.
So Janet, how important is it that people support both the March for Science and Saturday, April 29th event, the People's Climate March?
What's wonderful is you can support both. the nice thing about the Science March is it's all over the place. It's really a set of distributed marches. So you can look for one nearby you. There's probably one in bus or train or driving distance. And then, there's this march in D.C. on the 29th, where people from around the country are coming together to show our numbers en masse, and actually make the point that there are people who are still interested in having climate and climate justice and a just transition to jobs in the clean energy sector and the sustainability sector be right in front of the U.S. agenda. And so both of those events are really important, and there are ways to support them both physically in person, online through social media, and certainly through online actions, phone calls, and ways to weigh in with your decision makers.
Janet Redman, she's with Oil Change USA. She's also the policy director at Oil Change International. We've been talking about the March on Science, or for Science rather, that's happening on Earth Day, Saturday, April 22nd in Washington, D.C., and in over 500 locations across the U.S. and across the globe. So Janet, we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for watching and supporting the Real News Network.